I love you. Never know.
There was a party late at night after a gig. Willie liked to party. He liked to be out afterwards.
Yeah.
In this case, it was unfortunate, and somebody followed them, and a fight ensued, and the guy was knifed to death.
Look at even the death certificate and the actual telegram that we got, my mom and I got years ago, they didn't match. One said pneumonia, one said basically a heart attack.
They called him a singer's singer. Little Willie John had the voice that could stop and the temper that could end lives. One October night in 1964, both exploded in a Seattle club, and the man who gave the world fever was about to become a killer.
Willie was blamed, and Willie took the rap for it. Now, there were so many other things going on. This prosecuting attorney who did prosecute the case told me there were any number of issues that should have gotten him off.
But the real story isn't the stabbing. It's how Willie walked into prison healthy and died mysteriously in isolation less than 2 years later.
Something bad happened to him in prison. He shouldn't have died. That it was probably, in his own phrase, death by prison guard.
To understand how Little Willie John became a killer, you have to go back to the beginning, to a world that was designed to break men exactly like him. November 15th, 1937. In the company town of Cullendale, Arkansas, William Edward John was born into a world that would spend 30 years trying to kill him. One of 10 children crammed into a house where survival meant keeping your mouth shut and your fists ready. Willie learned early that size didn't matter if you had enough rage.
Well, he kind of grew up in the church, and he sang with his brothers and sisters years ago, before coming into being a professional singer.
When he was 4, the family fled to Detroit, chasing factory jobs and the promise of something better. But Detroit in the 1940s wasn't salvation. It was a pressure cooker where Southern black families fought for scraps while the automobile plants consumed their fathers and brothers like human coal. Willie was different from his siblings. Small, barely 5'4" and 126 pounds, he possessed something that couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. A voice that could stop and make grown men weep. But in a world that respected size and intimidation, that voice came with a target painted on his back. The rage started early. Insecurity about his height mixed with the daily humiliations of Jim Crow Detroit created a volatile combination. He was known to pack a gun and knife, not for show, but because he'd learned that respect had to be taken, never given. The gospel group he formed with his siblings in 1950, the United Four, was his first taste of power. When Willie John opened his mouth to sing, the world stopped and listened. But power without control is just destruction waiting to happen. His volatile temper, fueled by a taste for liquor and an insecurity regarding his slight height, would follow him from church pews to nightclub stages. Even at 14, when he sang with Count Basie's band, Willie was already drinking to quiet the demons in his head. The transformation from gospel singer to R&B star happened overnight when producer Henry Glover heard him sing at 5 p.m. and had him in a recording studio by 8 p.m. the same day. That split-second decision would make Willie John famous, but it would also put him on a collision course with an industry designed to break men exactly like him. His first hit, All Around the World, reached number 5 on the R&B charts in 1955. At 18, Willie John was suddenly the voice that white executives wanted to package and sell. But they wanted his talent without his attitude, his voice without his personality, his soul without his humanity. That was never going to work for someone who'd spent his life fighting for every scrap of respect. The warning signs were already there. After a brief tenure with the Paul Hucklebuck Williams Orchestra, John was dumped for misbehavior. The pattern was forming: brilliant performance followed by self-destructive behavior, followed by consequences that only made the rage burn hotter. 1956 changed everything. The song was called Fever, written by Eddie Cooley and Otis Blackwell, and when 18-year-old Willie John stepped into that Cincinnati recording studio, he created magic that would outlive them all. The track hit #1 on the R&B charts and sold over 1 million copies, making Willie John a household name overnight.
He was the link between the 40s and soul music. He was the guy. He was the guy who actually set the stage for soul and for Motown. And for guys like Marvin Gaye and Stevie grew up listening to him.
But success in 1950s, America came with rules, especially for young black performers. You smiled when they told you to smile. You recorded what they chose. You performed where they booked you. You never asked questions about money, credits, or respect. For someone with Willie's explosive personality, these constraints were like trying to cage lightning. At King Records, the battles began immediately. Label owner Sid Nathan, short, asthmatic, with a stubby cigar permanently dangling from his mouth, wanted Willie to sound blacker. Nathan preferred his performers to stay in easily marketable boxes, but Willie wanted to sound like Sinatra, with strings and sophistication. This wasn't just about artistic differences. It was about who controlled Willie John's identity. The impossible position became clear quickly. Willie was simultaneously too white for Nathan's taste and not white enough for the sort of national TV exposure that might have earned him a larger audience. While white performers could cross over and command respect across racial lines, black artists were expected to stay in their designated lane and be grateful for whatever scraps they received. The hit records kept coming. Talk to Me reached #5 on the R&B chart and #20 on the pop chart in 1958, selling over 1 million copies. In all, John made the Billboard Hot 114 times, influencing everyone from the Beatles to James Brown. His songs were being covered by artists who would become household names, while Willie fought for recognition and fair compensation. But behind the success, something was rotting. The drinking got heavier. The fights became more frequent. Willie was arrested multiple times for charges including narcotics, swindling, and grand larceny. These weren't random incidents. They were symptoms of a man whose talent was being systematically exploited while his humanity was ignored.
Willie liked to party. He liked to be out afterwards.
The seizures made everything worse. Willie suffered from epilepsy, a condition that carried massive stigma in the 1960s. For a performer whose livelihood depended on reliability, seizures were career poison. He was self-medicating with alcohol and creating a vicious cycle that was destroying his health, his judgment, and his future. By 1963, the machine had decided Willie John was more trouble than he was worth. John was dropped by his record company, King Records, in 1963. After 8 years of hit records and sold-out shows, the industry that had made millions off his talent decided he was disposable. The message was clear: behave or be destroyed. But Willie John had never learned to behave. The rage that had fueled his greatest performances was about to consume everything in its path. 1964 was the year everything fell apart. The British invasion was reshaping American music. Motown was rising, and the Chitlin circuit that had sustained R&B legends was dying. Artists like Willie John, who had built their careers on raw talent and word-of-mouth respect, were being pushed aside for more marketable, controllable acts. Without a record deal, Willie was reduced to playing smaller venues for less money, watching younger artists take the spotlight he had earned. The tours that once filled theaters were now one-nighters in clubs that barely covered expenses. It's likely that alcohol and drugs exacerbated Willie's epilepsy, and touring was not providing the kind of money he needed to support a wife and 2 young children. The breaking point came in Miami in August 1964. After a show, Willie got into an altercation with a man and attacked him with a broken bottle. The assault charges were serious enough, but Willie's response revealed how far he'd fallen. He jumped bail and fled to the West Coast, becoming a fugitive from justice. This wasn't just about avoiding jail time. Willie John was running from everything: his failed career, his mounting debts, his deteriorating health, and a legal system that seemed designed to destroy men like him. The tour that followed was supposed to be his comeback. Instead, it became a journey toward his final, fatal confrontation. By October, Willie had made it to Seattle for what would become his last stand. Over the weekend of October 16th and 17th, 1964, he performed 6 shows at the Magic Inn nightclub downtown. But something was different about these performances. Local musicians who had worked with Willie for years noticed the change immediately. His Friday night performance was a drunken mess. By Saturday, he was so intoxicated that seasoned performers were avoiding him. Little Bill Englehart, a local musician, recalled that Willie was already way drunk when he took the stage and was so inebriated that Englehart wisely passed on an offer to go party with him after the show. When your peers are afraid to be around you, it's a sign that you've crossed a line you can't come back from. But Willie John was beyond caring about consequences. The rage, the alcohol, the epilepsy, and years of systematic exploitation had created a perfect storm that was about to destroy 2 lives. After his final show at 1:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, Willie and his chauffeur Eddie Moore headed to Birdland, a legendary club where Seattle's black community came to see and be seen. Even at his lowest point, Willie could still command a stage, jumping up to sing a few songs with the house band. But the applause was temporary. Once the music stopped, he was still a broken man running from the law. The party that followed would end with blood on the floor and Willie John's transformation from fallen star to killer. October 18th, 1964. 918 23rd Avenue, Seattle. In the early hours of Sunday morning, Willie John's world was about to explode. What started as an after-hours party would end with one man dead and another destined for a prison cell. The house was an illegal gambling and drinking den where Seattle's night owls came when the legal establishments closed. Willie had arrived with Eddie Moore, his chauffeur, and 2 local women, Sylvia Banks and Kay Morgan. The atmosphere was loose, dangerous, and perfect for the kind of violence that had been building inside Willie for years. Also at the party was Kendall Roundtree, everything Willie John wasn't. At 6'2" and 200 pounds, Roundtree was a towering ex-convict whose physical presence commanded instant respect. A native of North Carolina, he liked to drink, and when he was drunk, he liked to fight. His arrest record spanned 8 states. Drunk and disorderly charges, punctuated by armed robbery, auto theft, and assault. 2 broken men were about to collide in the worst possible way. Willie John, the fallen star drowning in alcohol and rage. Kendall Roundtree, the career criminal whose life was a series of violent encounters. In that cramped house with alcohol flowing and tensions rising, they were about to write the final chapter of both their stories. The trigger was absurdly simple. Willie's female companion left her seat at the makeshift bar to use the bathroom. When she returned, Roundtree had taken her place. For most people, this would have been resolved with words or a polite gesture. But Willie John was operating on pure instinct and years of accumulated rage. For Willie, this wasn't about a chair. This was about respect, something he'd been fighting for his entire career. Every slight, every record executive who'd treated him like property, every venue that had paid him a fraction of what white performers earned, it all came flooding back in that moment. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged. Roundtree, used to intimidating smaller men, probably expected Willie to back down. Instead, Willie John did what he'd always done when cornered. He fought back with everything he had. Roundtree responded by landing a punch that bloodied Willie's mouth. In that split second, every humiliation Willie had ever suffered crystallized into pure violence. He backpedaled into the kitchen, Roundtree following, ready to finish what he'd started. But Willie John wasn't finished. As 3 men grabbed Roundtree to restrain him, Willie grabbed a small paring knife from the drain board. The blade that went into Kendall Roundtree's chest also severed any chance Willie had of redemption. The knife penetrated near the collarbone, slicing through lung tissue and nicking the aorta. Roundtree's handlers managed to get him upright and moving toward the front door, but before they could get him outside, the big man collapsed, unconscious and bleeding internally. For an hour, the party guests argued about what to do. Finally, they called an ambulance, telling the EMTs that Roundtree had suffered a heart attack. But blood on his chest gave away the truth, and soon the police were asking questions that would destroy Willie John's life forever. January 12, 1965. In a Seattle courtroom, Little Willie John's fate was being decided by 12 people who had never walked in his shoes. The trial lasted 3 days, but the verdict had been written long before the first witness took the stand. For a man facing decades in prison, Willie seemed surprisingly confident. He joked with prosecutors during breaks, even calling one of them colored and pointing out the irony. "You're the one who's colored. Look, you got yellow hair and blue eyes and white skin. I'm brown all over." His charm and humor couldn't hide the fact that this trial was rigged from the start. The prosecution had a strong case built on witness testimony and physical evidence. Multiple people had seen Willie with the knife. The blood evidence was overwhelming. But Willie's defense strategy was catastrophic. His lawyer claimed he'd suffered an epileptic seizure and couldn't remember what happened that night. Instead of painting Willie as a victim of circumstance defending himself against a much larger attacker, the epilepsy defense made him look unstable and dangerous. The lawyer was essentially arguing that Willie was prone to violent blackouts, hardly a winning strategy for someone facing murder charges. When Willie took the stand, he made his fatal mistake. Despite multiple witnesses placing the knife in his hands, he denied stabbing Roundtree. This wasn't just poor strategy, it was Willie's stage persona working against him. The smooth-talking charmer who could win over any audience thought he could perform his way out of a murder charge. The jury saw through the act immediately. Their initial straw vote was 10-2 in favor of conviction. According to one juror, the general feeling was that something was being covered up. Willie John was a little slick and overconfident. He thought he could talk his way out of it. Even the prosecutor later admitted that a competent defense attorney could have secured an acquittal. "I would have walked him out of there," prosecuting attorney Art Swanson told biographer Susan Whittle years later. There was enough reasonable doubt, self-defense, disparity in size, no clear witnesses to the actual stabbing, that Willie should have gone free. But with inadequate legal representation and his own arrogance working against him, Willie had talked himself into a prison sentence. The jury found him guilty of manslaughter with a deadly weapon, and Willie John's transformation from star to convict was complete. He posted $10,000 bail and appealed the verdict, spending 18 months in legal limbo while trying to mount a comeback. During this time, he recorded sessions for Capitol Records, Sinatra's label, the big leagues he'd always dreamed of reaching. But King Records blocked the release, claiming Willie had violated his contract. Even facing prison, the music industry was still controlling and destroying Willie John. The label would rather see his comeback album buried than allow him to succeed anywhere else. When his appeal was denied, Willie John walked through the gates of Walla State Penitentiary on July 6, 1966. He would never walk out alive. Washington State Penitentiary was a concrete tomb where broken men went to disappear. When 28-year-old Willie John walked through those gates on July 6, 1966, he entered a world where violence was currency, weakness meant death, and guards ruled with fists and batons. For a small man with a reputation for violence, Willie was a target from day one. His size made him vulnerable, but his conviction for killing a much larger man gave him some protection. It was a delicate balance that required constant vigilance and occasional violence to maintain. The fights came quickly. During his incarceration, John got into several more scuffles, demonstrating that prison hadn't broken his spirit. Yet. He also found ways to survive that connected him to his past. Willie wrote songs and performed for fellow inmates, turning the prison yard into an impromptu concert hall where his voice could still work magic. Even behind bars, Willie commanded respect from the music world. James Brown and Aretha Franklin made the pilgrimage to Eastern Washington to visit their old friend, bringing news from the outside world and reminders of what he'd lost. These visits were double-edged. They provided emotional support but also highlighted how far Willie had fallen. The guards weren't impressed by Willie's celebrity visitors. Prison records suggest he received the brute end of the treatment from the guards, indicating systematic abuse that the administration either encouraged or ignored. For guards who resented black inmates and celebrity status equally, Willie John represented everything they wanted to destroy. But something catastrophic happened between January and May 1968. Letters Willie wrote home in January were optimistic and articulate, suggesting a man who still believed in his future. But when James Brown visited that spring, he found Willie wheelchair-bound, hacking and sniffing with pneumonia, a broken shell of the man who had once commanded stages across America. The medical timeline doesn't add up. How does a relatively healthy man become wheelchair-bound and suffering from respiratory illness in a matter of months? Why was someone with pneumonia confined to maximum security isolation instead of receiving proper medical treatment? The official story claims Willie reported to the infirmary with pneumonia and was then locked in a maximum security isolation room. This sequence of events raises disturbing questions about whether Willie was being punished, neglected, or something worse. What happened in that isolation cell will never be fully known. But on May 26, 1968, at the age of 30, Little Willie John died under circumstances so suspicious that even the prosecutor who convicted him believed he was murdered. The man who gave the world fever drew his last breath alone, far from the stages where he had once made thousands of people feel alive. His death certificate listed the cause as a heart attack, but the prison sent his wife a telegram claiming he died from pneumonia. The discrepancy suggested a cover-up was already in motion. The contradictions began immediately. Heart attack on the death certificate, pneumonia in the telegram to his widow, tuberculosis mentioned in some reports, suspected by those who knew the prison system. Each explanation raised more questions than it answered, and none of them addressed the fundamental mystery. How does a man go from writing optimistic letters to dying in isolation in a matter of months? James Brown, who had watched Willie's career from opening act to headliner to convict, recorded an entire tribute album called Thinking About Little Willie John and a Few Nice Things. But even Brown, who understood the brutal realities of the music business, couldn't explain what had happened to his friend. He believed Willie had died of a broken heart, but the evidence suggested something far more sinister. The prosecutor who had sent Willie to prison, Art Swanson, was convinced that a violent attack led to his death. When the man who convicted you believes you were murdered, it suggests the truth is darker than any official report. Rumors of prison beatings and foul play surrounded Willie's death, but no investigation was ever conducted. The industry that had exploited Willie John moved quickly to erase him from memory. While his songs lived on through covers by the Beatles, Fleetwood Mac, and eventually Madonna, Willie himself became a cautionary tale whispered about in recording studios. His story was too dangerous to tell. It exposed too much about how the machine really worked. But the music survived because it was bigger than the man who created it. Fever continues to burn through speakers 6 decades later, a testament to the genius that the industry tried to control and ultimately destroyed. Every time someone covers Need Your Love So Bad or Leave My Kitten Alone, they're channeling the spirit of a man who refused to be broken until the very end. Willie John was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996, nearly 30 years after his death. The honor was overdue recognition for a man who had influenced everyone from James Brown to Stevie Wonder. But it also served as an admission that the industry had failed one of its greatest talents. The real tragedy isn't just that Willie John died young. It's that his death was preventable. A different lawyer might have secured his acquittal. A less racist prison system might have kept him alive. A more equitable music industry might have given him the respect and compensation he deserved from the beginning. Instead, Little Willie John became another casualty in America's long war against black excellence. His story reveals the machinery of systematic destruction that operated behind the scenes of the entertainment industry, the lawyers who didn't fight hard enough, the record executives who preferred exploitation to partnership, the prison system that viewed inmates as disposable. But Willie John's voice still echoes through time, a reminder that true artistry can't be killed even when the artist is destroyed. Every time someone feels the fire of fever, they're experiencing the immortal spirit of a man who gave everything to his music and paid the ultimate price for refusing to be anyone's performing monkey. The machine that destroyed Little Willie John is still operating today, still consuming talent and spitting out broken dreams. Willie's story isn't just history, it's a warning about what happens when genius meets a system designed to exploit rather than elevate. His death in that isolation cell wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of his legend. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.